Welcome. I'm Jennifer Walsh, Dean of the College of Environmental Design. Thank you very much for joining us this evening for what will, without doubt, be a compelling lecture by Professor Paul Collier of Oxford University. Tonight's lecture, as well as three major lectures that are to come this week by Janine Banyas tomorrow, Barbara Murray Stafford on Friday, and Manuel Castells on Saturday, have been organized as part of the College of Environmental Design's 50th anniversary celebration. Last fall, the college held a series of celebratory events to pay tribute to CED's history and legacy, featuring reflections from distinguished alumni and emeriti faculty and some major lectures about our past. And there was a lot to celebrate. In 1959, the college was established as the first school in the country to combine the disciplines of architecture, landscape architecture, and planning into a single college. And the college led the way toward an integrated approach to analyzing, understanding, and designing the built environment. CED was also among the first to conceptualize environmental design as inseparable from its social, political, economic, and cultural contexts, and to stress the importance of bringing science and scientists into planning and design arenas. At the same time, the college has historically emphasized environmental design as a profoundly ethical practice, co-produced through dynamic engagements with diverse communities, workers, businesses, and policymakers. And linking theory to practice, the college's faculty and students have long been known for what is called design activism, building housing for homeless or disabled people, creating new models of affordable housing, uncovering patterns of environmental injustice, or collaborating with communities to design parks and open space. But I think the question for us tonight is, what of the future? What's next? I think that as a college, I wasn't there, of course, but as a college, we were prescient and ahead of our time in 1959, and we need to remain so, looking forward and inventive, being inventive today, even if the future we envision has radically shifted. I think we need to dare to raise the urban question and struggle for social justice in the city, make buildings that are at once elegant and yet sustainable and regionally appropriate, push the frontiers of high-performance design and rigorous building science, join with grassroots groups in the making of well-loved places, and above all, envision human settlements of the future, replete with social meaning, ecological value, and possibilities for health and livelihood. This is a tall order, and it raises critical questions, such as, what should we be teaching to aspiring architects, planners, and urban designers and landscape architects, people who will be planning, designing, building, and rebuilding future human settlements from individual homes and gardens to global city regions? What skills do they need as the 21st century unfolds? How will the context confronting environmental designers shape the demands for future research and practice? This semester, as part of the 50th anniversary celebration, which we're beginning tonight, we'll begin to grapple with these challenging questions. We do so through an exploration of some of the most profound problems facing the planet, such as global poverty, the focus of tonight's lecture. And we hope to glimpse some of the most intriguing ways to rethink environmental design. These include harnessing models from the natural world to reshape our materials and the metabolism of cities, to protect our ecosystems and climate, and also turning to models of cognitive science and neurobiology to understand human attention, visual perception of the world, and ultimately creativity, which lies at the core of environmental design. They also involve understanding how grassroots movements around the world are emerging to reshape the city, its politics, and its spaces. And because the college has a long tradition of activism and listening to its the youthful students in the college, we're going to have a listening session and hear the voices of our youngest generations, recent alumni, assistant professors, graduate students, as they debate the future of our college and community, discuss the problematics that ought to drive our theoretical explorations, and the models of practice that we should be thinking about that may be capable of tackling the challenges ahead. So I hope very much that not only will you, I'm glad that you're with us tonight, and I hope that you will come tomorrow night to hear Janine Banyas and Friday to hear Barbara Maria Stafford, and then Saturday morning to hear Manuel Castells. That lecture will be in the Worcester Auditorium. What I'd like to do now is introduce to you Professor Ananya Roy, who will introduce our guest, and I'm delighted to do so. Professor Roy is a member of the Department of City and Regional Planning in the college, where she teaches in the fields of comparative urban studies and international development. She's also the education director at the Blum Center for Developing Economies, and she co-directs the Global Metropolitan Studies Center. She's renowned for teaching. In 2006, she was awarded Berkeley's Distinguished Teaching Award, as well as a Distinguished Faculty Mentor Award. And in 2008, she won the Golden Apple Teaching Award, a very coveted award on campus. And she regularly attracts legions of students to her classes on global poverty and practice. Professor Roy's scholarship is also widely recognized and includes the book City Requiem, Calcutta, Gender and the Politics of Poverty. And she's also co-edited a volume on urban informality and transnational perspectives from the Middle East, South Asia, and Latin America. Her current research project is book project is entitled Poverty Capital, Microfinance and the Frontiers of Millennial Development, which is supported by grants from foundations and also the National Science Foundation. So I'm pleased to turn the podium over now to introduce Professor Collier to Ananya Roy.
Thank you, Dean Bulge. Good evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker, Professor Paul Collier. He needs no introduction on this campus, but let me nevertheless give this a try. Paul Collier is Professor of Economics and Director for the Center for the Study of African Economies at Oxford University. From 1998 to 2003, he served as Director of the Development Research Group of the World Bank. Professor Collier is known for his incisive and decisive interventions in development studies and practice, especially around the persistence of poverty traps, the effects of aid on poverty and prosperity, and the conjunctures of war, conflict, natural resources, and poverty. These issues of global poverty are of central concern to many of us here at UC Berkeley, and they also constitute an important challenge to the disciplines and professions that make up the College of Environmental Design: city planning, architecture, environmental planning, urban design, and so forth. It is especially significant then that we have Professor Collier with us here for our 50th anniversary celebration. Paul Collier's most famous book is the 2007 The Bottom Billion: Why the Poorest Countries Are Failing and What Can Be Done About It. Most recently, he is the author of Wars, Guns, and Votes: Democracy in Dangerous Places. But let me talk for a few minutes about the bottom billion. Here is a text concerned with the latitudes of deprivation and poverty. It is an important counterpoint to the heady narratives of a flat world fueled by economic globalization. It is a book that was hailed by Nicholas Kristof as one of the best books in international affairs, and it went on to win, among many prizes, the Lionel Gelber Prize. In a review in the Financial Times, Martin Wolf concluded, "Read this book. You will learn much you do not know. It will also change the way you look at persistent poverty in a world of plenty." Now, I could list many more reviews. I could also list the numerous prestigious awards Professor Collier has received, and I could also list his many, many publications. But instead of doing so, let me instead quickly share 3 glimpses of the relevance and impact of Professor Collier's work. First, about a year ago, I was at a conference in England that had assembled the heads of prominent poverty-focused research centers around the world, from those in New York to those in Durban, South Africa. Quite a few hundred participants, all steeped in poverty research for many decades of their lives. They were all there. At some point in the conference, a question was asked: what is the one book that has most influenced the way in which you think about poverty? The answer, by a large majority, without question, was the bottom billion. Second, in 2007, when the bottom billion first appeared, Niall Ferguson, the historian of empire and globalization, wrote a review for the New York Times. He noted how the academic debate about poverty was dominated by two poles: Jeff Sachs's global Keynesianism and William Easterly's skepticism about aid. But now, here was Collier's intervention. Ferguson wrote, "Its analysis of the causes of poverty is more convincing. Second, its remedies are more plausible." Now, here at Berkeley, we do not often agree with Niall Ferguson, but on this one, he gets it right. He says, if Sachs seems too saintly and Easterly too cynical, then Collier is the authentic old Africa hand. He knows the terrain and has a keen ear. And finally, last week, as the images of post-earthquake Haiti filled our television screens, internet channels, and newspaper headlines, President Bill Clinton, charged with some of the relief and rehabilitation efforts, made note of the one plan that required attention, that of Professor Collier. President Clinton said, "But when we get through this, what I have strongly recommended to do is to simply take the economic plan that the Haitian government has already endorsed, which is a modified version of what Professor Paul Collier did for the United Nations, and just go right back to work." Indeed, Professor Collier, in one of his many roles, this one as Special Advisor on Haiti for the UN Secretary General, has long been thinking about development in Haiti. In the wake of the earthquake, he has called for a Marshall Plan for Haiti, one that is genuine rebuilding. These are but three glimpses of a vast universe of influence, intervention, and impact in the worlds of research, theory, and practice. It is a special honor to have with us here, on the occasion of CED's 50th anniversary celebrations, Professor Paul Collier. I now invite him to the podium to deliver his talk.
Well, thanks very much, Professor Roy. Introductions like that always leave me terrified. It was terrifying enough thinking that I was launching this distinguished series of lectures on your 50th anniversary, so congratulations. The first thing I want to say to the students in the audience is how lucky you are. And that's a message not from me, but from my son, Daniel, who actually wants to be you. His ambition is he's an American citizen, so his ambition is to come here and indeed study design and architecture. So I'm under instructions that when I leave, I've got to collect the application forms. It'll be a little while before they're in the post because he's only 9. Now, I'm going to start. My theme today is about design at the bottom, design for the poorest societies on Earth, and I'm going to start with Haiti, partly because it's a place I've recently been very involved in, but most obviously this is a huge construction and design task awaiting the world. If not you, who? So it's both vastly important in itself and it's paradigmatic of this whole class of societies at the bottom. I'll just sketch a little bit about my own involvement, which actually grows out of my book, The Bottom Billion, because one of the more enthusiastic readers was Ban Ki-moon, the Secretary General of the United Nations. So Haiti's been hit by a series of tragedies, and before the earthquake, the most recent one was the hurricanes of the fall of 2008. And Ban Ki-moon went and visited and realized that the hard task of putting in over 10,000 Brazilian peacekeepers had been done for 5 years, and yet there wasn't enough economic development. And so he asked me, please go and see what you can do. So that was the start of my own involvement. Since the earthquake, I've been re-involved, partly through the United Nations, partly through the State Department. What can I say that's not trivial about the challenge of design and planning in Haiti? The first thing is that we must move beyond relief. The attention of the world, which is actually unprecedented amount of attention, gives us the potential to move beyond relief. But of course, what's happened immediately is a set of appeals for money for relief. And so the first challenge was to get an agenda that went beyond relief. Now, that immediately encounters an architecture issue, a design issue, and that is there are 600,000 people in Haiti who are homeless, and so they need to be housed. They need to be housed in something, and that something has to be somewhere. And so what are the options? One option is of a vast tent city just outside Port-au-Prince. And that's, as it were, the default option. There's a flood of NGOs going in, and the default option is tent city. And tent city, I think, is the wrong thing to do in two senses. One is, in 5 months' time, it'll be hurricane season again in Haiti. And so just putting up a lot of tents is just not a robust solution to the housing problem. I should say that we know from elsewhere that tents, although meant to be temporary, often turn into structures that are there for several years. But they're not structures which can be built on. And so the alternative to tent city is housing solutions which can be quick and cheap, but which can be expandable. For example, there's an organization called Habitat, which specializes in one-room structures which can be put up very quickly, very cheaply. But those one-room structures then have the capacity that households themselves can add extra rooms later. And so you build something that is there to last and has the potential for expansion. So tents versus structures is an important issue. The other dimension that has to be acted upon quickly but has long-term implications is where. Right? I'm an economist, and economics has largely forgotten questions like where, but you can never forget the question of where. Right? That is the built environment. And what do we know about Port-au-Prince? We know that it's a very dangerous location to have a third of Haiti's population living there. Right? It's on an earthquake fault, it's very subject to hurricanes. What better can be done? There's actually several locations in Haiti that are much safer. The earthquake fault doesn't cover the whole of Haiti at all. It's a relatively narrow exposure. So there are large areas of Haiti that are much safer. So the task of where is a task of relocation. So the housing needs not only to be housing that can be built up rather than just a tent, but it needs to be put in places that encourage relocation of as much of the population as possible out of Port-au-Prince. But of course, the built environment is not just residential. And so the where question is not just a matter of finding places that will be safe locations to live. They have to be places that combine safety of residence with opportunities for jobs. And this is something that Haiti's never actually had. There's mass unemployment, and it's been mass unemployment for decades. And so the next challenge is to do the relocation in areas where it will be possible to create economic opportunities. Now, what are the economic opportunities? In the very short term, the reconstruction itself is a massive employment opportunity. Right? So that opportunity needs to be harnessed, and that tells you something about how the construction has to be undertaken. That the nightmare scenario is that Haitians stand and watch whilst international construction comes in, either commercial or well-meaning NGOs who do the work for them. Okay? So the challenge is to create jobs for Haitians, but of course Haitians themselves largely have not got the skills and the firms, the organizations, to manage the construction process. And so the right balance is to bring in internationally the organization and the skill bottlenecks, very much including your own skills, and combine that with the less skilled Haitian labor, so that you create jobs for Haitians that matched with international skills. So that's the short-term employment opportunity, is the reconstruction process itself. But that has to phase into sustainable jobs, and that means building new economic opportunities. Haiti actually abounds in unexploited economic opportunities. And here it's got many more opportunities than most countries that are put in the same category of fragile state. Afghanistan, for example, really doesn't have anything like the economic opportunities that Haiti has. So if I just sketch 3 opportunities for longer-term employment in Haiti, one is within agriculture. There are a number of crops and products that could be produced and exported here, such as mangoes. Haiti grows the best mangoes on earth, and yet they rot on the trees next to the biggest market for mangoes on earth. So there's a logistical problem that hasn't been addressed. It's not a rocket science logistical problem, but it's not been addressed. So that's one set of opportunities in agriculture. And the bottleneck there is really designing the transport routes that will connect with market. The second set of opportunities are in light manufacturing, especially garments. Haiti already has a very good trade deal with America called HOPE 2, which has barely been used, and that's got another 9 years to go. The trade deal could be made even better, and now is the opportunity to get through Congress the slight changes that would make that a better trade deal. As with all trade deals, the devil is in the detail. Right? And so it's a matter of just tweaking the detail a little bit. Haiti has a very good workforce. It already has garments factories. And the garments factories which are succeeding, and there are some of them, they tell us what's necessary to make this a scalable activity for a lot of jobs. And the Haitian garment factories that are succeeding are the ones that have located right along the border with the Dominican Republic, literally right along the border. And why are they there? Because they can plug into electricity from the Dominican Republic, literally, and they can use the road network and the port network of the Dominican Republic. So that Dominican infrastructure, combined with Haitian labor, turns out to be enough to be fully competitive. So how can we scale that up? Well, not by lining everything up along the border with the Dominican Republic, but by building the infrastructure that would make the difference. Infrastructure is not just a matter of physically building, it's the design of an operation of the system, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The third set of economic opportunities are in tourism. And again, Haiti has some of the most amazing unexploited tourist sites in the Caribbean. It's got an astounding historic fort up on a great hill, which is a World Heritage Site. It's within easy reach of the coast, and yet nobody visits it. It's unvisited. It has the most famous pirate island in the Caribbean, full of wonderful beaches. Nobody goes there. This could be, this could be sort of Disneyland Pirates of the Caribbean 4. I get that from my 9-year-old. There's certainly a market there. So there are a lot of economic opportunities that could generate jobs. And so the challenge is to spot those economic opportunities, think ahead, so that the housing is placed in locations where we can subsequently then build these economic opportunities. And building the economic opportunities is, again, a building task. It's putting in place the infrastructure that makes these things feasible. There's a longer-term agenda as well, which affects design. And I'll just sketch two aspects. One is, why was the earthquake so devastating? One reason was it was a big earthquake, but why did it kill so many people and leave so many people homeless? And the answer is something very mundane: building standards. Building standards were not enforced. Right? And so that was a failure of regulation, and it was a failure of the whole organization that would normally impose regulation. Right? Decent building standards, properly enforced in Haiti, would have saved thousands upon thousands of lives. Right? And so that's, again, it's a professional challenge. I'm from a profession, academics, where I've learnt the following rule of thumb about professions, that either professions self-police or they're not policed at all. Because professions have so much inside knowledge that if they don't self-police, the chances of policing them from outside are very limited. Right? Berkeley may be very different, but in my university, Oxford, we're not actually policed from the top. I mean, the Vice-Chancellor might think he does, but it's not true. And we're certainly not policed from the bottom, right? Students probably should have much greater say over what our salaries are and so forth, but they don't, right? And what makes academics get up in the morning is the thought of what other academics down the corridor would say if they don't. Right? And that, I suspect, is true of a lot of professions, all the professions, really, including the construction profession. And so somewhere along the line in Haiti, ethical standards collapsed. And because ethical standards collapsed, buildings collapsed. Right? And the job of restoring proper ethical standards into that profession, one way of doing that, I think probably the most effective way, is to reintegrate the professional organizations in Haiti with the international profession, just to try and strengthen what should have been proper standards. So standards are one lesson. What else? System design. System design for the provision of services is really very particular depending upon the sort of service. Let me contrast three services that are absolutely essential in all low-income societies. One is phones, one is water, and one is electricity. Now, it turns out that phones are really easy to provide nowadays, anywhere. Right? Even Somalia, which doesn't have a government at all, there's phones. And the reason for that is that mobile phone technology is very, very undemanding of governance. The simple technology of prepayment means that you avoid any problems of credit or anything like that. So in Haiti, there's a huge and very well-functioning mobile phone network. It was cheap to build. Everybody uses them. There's no problems. At the other end of the spectrum from getting a network of phones is getting a network of water that functions. And water is really problematic because you can't work a prepayment system, and if people don't pay, you can't realistically cut the water off. And so trying to get a water delivery system that is financially viable in terms of people paying for the water is radically harder than building a mobile phone network. And in between mobile phones and water, there's electricity, which again, Haiti is chronically short of electricity, but it's easier than water. But Haiti suffers from there's not enough generation capacity. That generation capacity then doesn't translate into electricity that is properly priced, and then about half the electricity that is generated is stolen. So there's a theft problem, and there's an underpricing problem, and there's a non-payment problem. So electricity supply has failed in Haiti, both because there's a lack of physical infrastructure and because of the design issues. And the trick or the solution for a lot of these services is to try and make more of them look like mobile phones, as it were, where possible. And sometimes it's not possible, as with water. So let me conclude on Haiti with saying, is there hope, and what will it take? I think there certainly is hope. What it will take is three things. It will take a strategy, it will take money, and it will take a decision structure. Of these, the strategy is the least problematic. The government of Haiti had already proposed a strategy last April, which was not a bad strategy. It was partly what I'd done. It was partly that provoked the Haitian government to think itself what it wanted, and it then pitched that to the international community. The idea of pitching it was that the momentum created by the hurricanes would induce the international community to step up to the plate. Didn't work. It didn't work. One thing we learned from that is speed is of the essence. By the time the Haitian government pitched its proposals, the hurricanes had been about 8 months previously. It was all forgotten. The energy for international action had been dissipated. So one conclusion from this disastrous earthquake is speed is of the essence. There has to be a strategy on the table fast. Now, as far as I can see, all the key actors have learned that lesson. So they met very rapidly in Montreal a couple of weeks ago, and there they convened a meeting that's going to be held in March, where hopefully the money for a strategy will be found. So they've learned that lesson. Of course, the strategy can't just be the pre-earthquake strategy. As I've tried to sketch, there's a lot of issues that weren't anticipated, issues of relocation that need to be built in, but they're not difficult issues. They're not difficult issues to think about. They may be difficult to do, but they're not difficult to get into a strategy. So the strategy, I think, will be there. Because the strategy will be there rapidly, the money will be there. The response to the Haitian catastrophe has been without historical precedent. Do you know, about half of all American households have donated one way or another to the Haitian appeal. That's an astounding degree of involvement by Americans, and Americans are not alone. And so the sheer scale of international response pushed from people's humanity, which is pushing their governments into action, that is astounding and very hopeful for the future. So, a strategy, money, and then the hardest thing will be a decision structure that can actually get all this construction, the residences, the infrastructure, the systems that are needed to run the infrastructure in place. And the reason that's difficult is that there are two coordination challenges, one international and one internal to Haiti. The international coordination problem is that the international community is a zoo of a lot of different actors. They all talk the talk of coordination, but what they mean by that is everybody wants to coordinate, but nobody wants to be coordinated. And so we have to move beyond the talk of coordination to the reality of being coordinated. And that for that, there actually has to be some authority in charge that tells this plethora of organizations what to do. Ideally, I would like to see a common fund with an authority having power of expenditure over a common fund. Since a lot of funds are being built, it would have to be a fund of funds, but that may be feasible. There's an equivalent problem within Haiti. The government of Haiti was already a pretty fragile entity. It was starting to improve over the last 2 or 3 years, but it was a pretty fragile entity. And now it's overwhelmed. The earthquake has enormously increased the burden on the government at the same time that it's decimated it. And so the government itself is not in a position to provide the coordination that is otherwise missing. And so I think the sort of thing we will need to see is some organization which combines a senior figure in the Haitian government, such as the Prime Minister, with a senior international figure, such as President Bill Clinton. Something like that. President Clinton is enormously well regarded in Haiti. And so I think that sort of alliance would be viable. But we need a common authority that can then spend the money, allocate the land, and redesign the structures, such as how an electricity system actually operates. Let me turn from Haiti to the bigger picture. Haiti is paradigmatic of a class of countries, right, I call the bottom billion. And what will those societies be like as they develop? What will be the design and planning challenges? And let me suggest a couple of features of design that the design challenge that may seem obvious to you or may not. And the first is that for most of these societies, the future will be urban. That what they will go through is a very rapid urbanization. Now that's, to an extent, a heretical view within development studies and within development agencies, and even within a lot of NGOs. The NGOs are often a bit schizophrenic. They often kind of in love with the peasant societies, and so to an extent, the development agenda that is commonly promoted is one of preserving a peasantry, preserving a peasant society, just making it better off, but in some way preserving it. And I think that's a mistaken vision. It's certainly not a vision shared by peasants. If you ask, peasant children vote with their feet, they go to cities. And the challenge is to make those cities viable. So the reality will be urbanization. Now, what sort of urbanization? I think there will be, let me take it in one leap. It'll be coastal megacities. Why megacities? Because there is a relationship between productivity and city size. Each time you double the size of a town or city, you raise productivity of the people living in that city by something between 4 and 8%. And so if you move from people living in villages to people living in megacities, you've doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled and doubled. You've doubled so many times that you've got a massive uplift in productivity just from the change of spatial organization of the population. So that's why big is beautiful. Why coastal? Because to find jobs will involve integration into the global economy. And certainly for manufacturing, modern manufacturing has globalized, and so it's very intensive in transport, and transport is still predominantly by sea. Modern manufacturing has changed massively from the image of manufacturing that grew up in the 1930s, the sort of Henry Ford type image. I became aware of that change partly through some of my own research, but I've recently been lobbying within the European community to get the European Union's trade policy towards the bottom billion redesigned. And I discovered that the vision that the Commissioner for Trade Policy had was very much that 1930s vision of the Ford factory, of vertical integration of manufacturing. You put the raw materials in at one end, and they're thumped and bashed and go through all sorts of transformations, and eventually, out of the other end of the factory comes a car. Right? And modern manufacturing isn't like that. It used to be, but actually, for the past 30 years, manufacturing has been going through what's called vertical disintegration. That factory, all the different tasks that used to happen inside that factory, have been split up into lots of different tasks, which are then traded. That's what's called trade in tasks. Now, potentially, trade in tasks is very good news for the countries right at the bottom that haven't yet broken in, because they only need to skill up in one task, rather than the whole integrated process of producing a product. And so the skill demands are much smaller. But it's not all good news, because although vertical disintegration helps new entrants at the bottom, there's another trend which doesn't help them, and that is that within each task, there are very powerful economies of scale. And so the modern form of industry is a cluster of firms all coming together doing the same task. So spatial clustering of a single task. Very different from the sort of picture of how to make a car in the 1930s. Let me give you one number that you'll probably remember from this lecture, and it concerns buttons. These things. Two-thirds of the world's buttons are made in one city. And 30 years ago, that city was a village. I find that really quite amazing. And once you realize it's amazing and understand why it's happened, you'll have learned quite a lot about the economic processes in modern manufacturing. So why is it that two-thirds of the world's buttons are made in one place? It's not that Mega Button Incorporated happens to be located there, right? There is, thank God, no Mega Button Incorporated, right? It's lots of little button firms all in the same place. So what's going on? Nor is it that if you scratch the soil in Kowtow, you find buttons underneath, right? It's not a natural endowment. Right? The real message is this could have happened anywhere. Why there? Few random, trivial factors of the moment. But once you've got a cluster, then the forces for agglomeration are very powerful, because by grouping together, you lower costs. Yeah? It's true not just in buttons, it's true of all the stages of producing a lot of different products. Like the concentration in zip production is even higher than the concentration in buttons production. Right? When I went round the garment factories in Haiti, I discovered that the clusters are too small to sustain repair of equipment. And so if a machine breaks down, that machine is down for weeks until somebody has flown in, either from the Dominican Republic or America. And so there's the cost of producing garments in Haiti is high because there aren't enough firms. And of course, there aren't enough firms because the costs are high. So there's a chicken and egg problem. That's a coordination phenomenon. Right? And again, the recovery and the flood of interest and investment that could happen post-earthquake is an opportunity to crack that coordination problem. I said exactly this last week in Davos to a meeting of quite a large group of international businessmen who were convened by the World Economic Forum to discuss investment in Haiti. And they got the point. They got the point. So I'm quite hopeful that we can use this as a moment to coordinate investment. In Africa, which is where most of my work is concerned, there's a further hurdle in getting to these megacity clusters, and that is that Africa is politically fragmented into 53 little countries. The whole population of Africa is much less than the population of India, and yet India's 1 and Africa's 53. And that affects the spatial concentration of activity. So if you look at city size in India and in Africa, it's radically different. And it's because of this political fragmentation. There are fewer cities in Africa, and the cities that you have are smaller, and there are no megacities. There's no cities in Africa much over 10 million, whereas there are 2 cities in India over 20 million. So in addition to the building the clusters, there's a need to kind of metaphorically rub out the borders in Africa, try and get integration between countries. That's something that Africa's been trying to do for a long time, but it needs to get much more successful. Let me start to draw to a close and turn to some practical examples of what all this means. And I'll just draw upon 3. Freetown, Lagos, and South Africa. Freetown in Sierra Leone. I was there last month, and it's a place where I'm regularly engaged. Half of the population of Sierra Leone is now crowded into Freetown as a result of the long periods of civil unrest and civil war. But Freetown is a nightmare. It's got the population of a biggish city, but the urban design of a small town. There's been no significant infrastructure construction for 50 years. And so you can imagine what happens. The place doesn't work. All these scale economies that we get from bigger cities are not automatic. They're not just coming from people being together. They're coming from design responding appropriately to people coming together. And in Freetown, they haven't. In Freetown, you cannot move. There are very few roads, and those roads are just one big traffic jam. Because private individuals have been able to invest in transport. They buy cars and trucks, but the government hasn't invested in transport for decades. And so we've got this radical imbalance between private investment in transport and public investment in transport. Those investments are complements, and so the imbalance lowers productivity all round. So Freetown in Sierra Leone is an example where the place is crying out for good urban design. There's a chronic shortage of residences. Once those residential areas are built, how are people going to move from where they live to where they can work? And there's a chronic shortage of the infrastructure needed, the economic infrastructure, to create the jobs. Freetown is a glorious location, slap on the coast. It's as fine a real estate as San Francisco, as the Bay Area. It's marvelous real estate, and yet it's not been harnessed yet. So Freetown could employ this roomful for all your working lives. Lagos, along the coast of West Africa. Lagos is West Africa's big opportunity for a megacity. It's already at 10 million. It's a very good location. It's a very good natural harbour. And Nigeria has a lot of money coming from oil that could turn Lagos into a megacity that functions. And at the moment, it doesn't. Right? Famously, the infrastructure is inadequate. Famously, because the responses to that total inadequacy are sometimes almost comic. At one stage, when there was a military government, the government decided to ban cars with sort of cars into two groups of number plates, and you could only use your car on alternate days. So, of course, the Nigerian rich then bought two cars. So Lagos is West Africa's opportunity to break into to the global big time, to have a megacity with this brilliant location near world markets, nearer world markets than any Asian city. And it's a design obstacle that is frustrating it. Finally, South Africa. I was with the new finance minister of South Africa just last week, and he was explaining to me how they'd got their urban design issues wrong as a post-apartheid government. They'd focused on housing, which was desperately needed in the new South Africa, but then they decided that their criterion for housing was find cheap land. And so they found cheap land a long way out of cities, and then they built housing estates on that cheap land. And now, he said, his words were, we've built apartheid 2. In fact, he said it's worse than apartheid 1 because where we've put these houses, we can't get services, and these people can't get to jobs. We failed to integrate the housing with the basic service provision and with jobs. And that, to my mind, is the fundamental design issue that has to be navigated in all the countries of the bottom billion. At the moment, they've nowhere to live, they've totally inadequate basic services, and they've no jobs. And those three have to be coordinated in space. And that's your job. Finally, what will drive that urbanization process? Where will the money come from? In Haiti, I've suggested it will come from an international moment of concern. But elsewhere in the bottom billion, it won't come from international concern financing it. So it won't cascade down from heaven, it will bubble up from the ground. And let me close with the other number that you might remember from tonight. One is about buttons, but the other is about what's under the ground in the bottom billion. And so we'll close with this bit of information. We'll take the average square kilometre of the rich countries, the OECD, and the value of subsoil assets in that, underneath that average square kilometre, is around $120,000. And now we're going to take the average square kilometre of Africa. I could have taken the whole of the bottom billion, but we'll just take Africa. And what's the number? It could be less, it could be more. Sometimes I make people vote on it, but it's not fair. Let me tell you, it's radically less. It's about $20,000, $23,000. Everybody's astonished by that. When I take a vote on it, it runs about 98% voting that it's a lot more. And that's because people think of Africa as resource-rich. In one sense, Africa is resource-rich. The value of its known natural assets greatly exceeds the pitiful level of investment in the continent. So the natural assets greatly exceed the value of the invested assets. But that's a statement about the inadequacy of the invested assets, not the abundance of the natural assets. But the figure I've given you is only about known natural assets. Right? I'd have liked to give you the figures for unknown natural assets, but I couldn't find them. The most likely figure for Africa's natural assets per square kilometre is that it's much the same as anywhere else, much the same as the OECD. Right? And those natural assets will be discovered over the next decade or two. Africa is already resource-rich relative to its invested assets. Multiply by 5 to get some idea of what's really there. And this could be a tidal wave of money. The challenge is to harness that tidal wave for good. Right? For example, in Nigeria, the oil needs to be turned into a functioning city of Lagos. To date, that hasn't happened. And for my mind, in the bottom billion, the struggle of the next decade, the number one struggle is the harnessing of those natural assets for this process of investing effectively within the country. I'll end with an advert, since that's what my next book is about. It's called The Plundered Planet, and it's coming out in April. Now, just to conclude, what I've sketched is a design task that will last your profession not just for a few years, but for a working lifetime. The task of building an effective environment for homes, for services, for jobs in these societies is a task of decades. Right? I hope many of you will turn your lives to it, and I hope, I have to say, Dean, that my own son will get the opportunity to do so as well. Thank you very much.
We have a microphone here, and we are happy, I think Professor Collier is happy to entertain questions. So if you wouldn't mind, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please step forward to the microphone, and we'll take questions. Anyone, come. I'll start, if I might, since no one's here. You talked about urbanization and continuing increases in productivity with increases of population size. And I wondered about diminishing returns to scale and the question of not only polarization of population, but also backwash and the ultimate possibility of the development of a greater, denser hierarchy of cities around a growth pole. And if there was not at some point that you would find this kind of diminishing returns to scale happening.
Yeah, I have actually tried to do a bit of rudimentary research on that, and I'm certainly not proud of it, but it does find roughly what you're pointing to, and it's this, that for middle income and higher income societies, the bigger the better in terms of productivity. But for the lowest income societies, no. That beyond a certain size, you start to get diminishing productivity. And I think the answer to that, mine's a statistical result, but I think it's basically what I described about Freetown or Lagos, that if you just herd people together as an act of desperation, these are people with no opportunities. In Sierra Leone, they were frightened into living in cities. In Lagos, they were starved into living in cities. If it's just a push of poverty and desperation, and nothing is provided in these cities by way of infrastructure, then you don't get that productivity boost. The productivity boost is there for the picking, but it has to be designed and invested in rather than just something that comes from herding people together. And on the bit of evidence I've got, that process has so far failed in the poorest countries.
Paul, thank you very much indeed for a very entertaining and informative presentation. When you talked about Haiti, you talked about strategy, money, and decision structure. And somehow or other, that whole notion of the decision structure question got a little bit swept under the rug when you came to Africa, because whenever one talks about the development of Africa, I think I start worrying about Nigeria, because it's got a lot of resources, but it's also got a, shall I put it this way, a fairly corrupt government. When you start talking about development in some of the smaller countries, I start thinking about Rwanda. It struck me too very forcefully, and I'm sure you've thought about this, and I'd like to hear your further thoughts. But the decision structure in Africa obviously has to be addressed too. How are we going to do that given the recent track record there?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I think there are, let me give you two distinct answers. One is that in countries like Nigeria with vast natural resources, and as I sketched, these natural resources are going to get a lot bigger. That's the future of most of these countries over the next couple of decades. Big money from natural resources. If history repeats itself, that will be, at best, a wasted opportunity and may even turn worse than that. And so how can we do something to try and stop history repeating itself? First of all, we need to realize that these are internal struggles within these societies. There's a limit to what we as outsiders can do. They're internal struggles, and those internal struggles have usually gone wrong. Right? The crooks have won because the crooks have the money and the guns and are willing to use the money and the guns. Right? Some of my friends in Africa are the heroic figures that have tried to oppose all this. In Nigeria, Nuhu Ribadu, who features in my new book. Nuhu was the head of the police unit appointed by former President Obasanjo to pursue crooks. And in fact, it's an interesting story because it shows what we can do to help. The only reason that this unit was established was it was an inadvertent consequence of 9/11. One of the side effects of 9/11 was that the American government decided to toughen up on financing of terrorism. And so it produced a list of countries, not countries which were financing terrorism, but countries where the financial system was so weak that you couldn't tell whether you were financing terrorism or not. And Nigeria was on that list. And President Obasanjo, to his great credit, his mission as president had been, he was the first properly democratically elected president. His mission was to clean up Nigeria's image. And so he said, we've got to do whatever it takes to get off this list. And so he appointed Nuhu as policeman, created a unit of 40 people, 40 policemen, and Nuhu realized that here he was in a sea of corruption, he better go for the big fish. And so he did. He arrested the president of the Senate. To my mind, his sweetest moment must have been when he arrested his own boss, the Inspector General of Police, who, through assiduous saving of his salary, had accumulated $150 million. And you think, what is behind that $150 million? That is what some people paid in order to get the police off their backs. And so if they were prepared to pay this guy $150 million, think what that was, gear that up to the money that was being stolen. Yeah? So I tell that story because, first of all, it emphasizes that the key struggles are internal to these societies. Secondly, that there are things we can do to help tilt the balance. In that case, it was completely inadvertent. America never meant to do anything to address corruption in Nigeria. It just meant to protect itself against terrorist financing. But it's actually arguably the most useful thing that America's ever done for Nigeria. You know? What I and a group of colleagues are trying to do, which is limited, but I think has some traction, is to make it easier to build a critical mass of informed opinion in the resource-rich societies. And so we've implemented an idea that I floated in my little book, The Bottom Billion. I suggested what was needed was a natural resource charter, which set out the decision chain involved in harnessing natural assets. And now there is one. There's a natural resource charter. It's a website. You can just you Google naturalresourcecharter.org, and you can see it. More importantly, people living in these resource-rich, low-income countries can see it. We've got our own governance structure with President Ernesto Zedillo, the one honest former president of Mexico, as our chair. Mike Spence, the Nobel laureate from across the bridge, as heading our technical group. And the website just lays out in simple terms the decision chain involved in harnessing these resources. And the idea is that charter can grow to become, if you like, an international convention by stealth, an international convention from the bottom up, which then, because it's a website, it's easy to access, it can help to lower the costs of more informed societies that can then benchmark their own government's decisions against these international norms. Now, that's a very far cry from sending in the gunboats, but it's the more realistic approach to tilting the balance in these internal struggles now. Yeah.
Hi, I'm an undergraduate here and studying political economy, and many of us on this campus are beginning to get interested in social businesses, social ventures, and I was very interested in what you said regarding clusters and how businesses tend to congregate in certain areas, and my thoughts there, though, that often it requires significant investment to get something like that started, and for those of us who might one day only have access to, let's say, $25,000 for a small project, what strategies can we use, and what do you think are the most effective ways for small-scale social ventures to have an impact?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, first of all, I think this whole social enterprise development is fantastically exciting. Right? If I were your age, and it's hard to believe, but once I was, right? When I was your age, these sort of things didn't really exist. There was a gap in the market, and that's where I would now put my energy. I think social enterprise doesn't realize what its core advantage is. And its core advantage is not its money, it's its organization. You have this, often these social enterprises have the skills to run an organization efficiently. And that's a new phenomenon, I'm afraid, in the world of NGOs and development aid and all that sort of thing. These are smart young people able to run an organization. Now, I believe that the financing problem can be taken care of. These activities can be scaled in one of two ways. One is you can get a parallel development of venture capital, which is willing to put significant money in as an enterprise succeeds. 3 of the businesses I discussed in Davos, who I talked with about Haiti, were venture capital businesses. And my argument with them was that there's a need for risk capital that is patient, that is willing to go through the, as it were, the J-curve phase in which these clusters form and the costs come down. And they bought that. They bought that. And so the challenge is to match the venture capital, the social enterprise organizations with the patient venture capital. So that's one way of financing. Another way of financing, and these are complementary approaches, is to channel aid, instead of aid going directly to NGOs, which is what it typically does at the moment. You know, in Haiti, about 90% of the basic services are provided by NGOs, not by the government. And it's a total financial bypass of government. I think a better approach would be to channel aid money through a public agency that could then finance NGOs and social enterprise, subject to those social enterprises demonstrating performance. And so that structure would build in accountability into NGOs and a sort of finance for social enterprise. So I know that the obsession with social enterprise, I think if it's an obsession, is financial sustainability. And I think that's kind of the wrong obsession. I think your calling card is that you can bring in cost effectiveness, efficiency into the supply of basic things that poor people need. And then it's a matter of channeling other people's money so that if you demonstrate efficiency, it can be scaled up. So don't just think boutique, think a scalable enterprise. Thanks.
Hi, so you mentioned Nigeria a lot in your book, and now you did as well. And I'm interested to know, since you seem to have some sort of respect for Obasanjo, what you think about him imposing a dead president on us, that's Yar'Adua, and now that we are on the terrorist watch list, considering that the UK actually bred the terrorists. So I want to know what you think about that situation. The Nigerian situation right now, since we don't have a president, and now we're also on the terrorist watch list.
Yeah. Nigeria is certainly complicated. Of course, a lot of my friends were part of what I consider as the reforming phase of roughly 2003 through to 2007, when some pretty heroic things were done. A lot wasn't done, but a lot was done. And let me highlight just a few of the really big things that Nigerians ought to be grateful for. That was a period of a global oil boom, 2003 through 7, very obviously in retrospect. The last global oil boom of the late 1970s and early 80s, the Nigerian government of the time, the Shagari government, had got it disastrously wrong, because it had spent as though there were no tomorrow. The oil was being depleted, but instead of saving and investing the revenues, the Nigerian government of the Shagari era did the opposite. It borrowed internationally, and it borrowed very heavily. So it geared up the oil boom into an intense boom financed partly by oil and partly by debt. And that whole thing crashed because the debt financing was an unsustainable model. Now, the Nigerians who lived through that boom, of course, think it was great. What they looked back on with horror was the post-boom period, the crash. Actually, the crash of the late 80s was relatively well managed. But it was a crash. It was inevitable. People were very much poorer. The oil price had collapsed, and instead of being able to consume out of borrowing, we had to start to repay. The Nigerian reformers of 2003 to 7 had learned that lesson. And so during this second oil boom, Nigeria accumulated $70 billion worth of reserves. 70 billion. So a very prudent set of actions which Nigerians now are benefiting from, because, of course, the world economy did crash, but Nigeria was cushioned by having built up that 70 billion. So on the big ticket items, Nigeria was being very much better managed. Now, of course, just at the moment, Nigeria isn't being well managed. Right at the top, there's a vacuum. And hopefully that will be resolved. Until it's resolved, there's a lot of knock-on consequences from that. But all these societies, there's struggles within the society, and the good guys don't always win. Historically, the good guys have usually lost, and so we must expect a lot of setbacks. I think Nigerian society is a lot better informed now than it was 30 years ago, and so I think it's a more hopeful environment. Some battles have been won, some lost. The war continues.
I'm sure that Professor Collier will stick around if people have more questions. We wanted to give you something to take away. Feeling a little bit guilty because it's heavy, but it's something that you might enjoy from our faculty. Thank you very much.